A racist police officer thought he had full control when he stopped and aggressively confronted a black man at a gas station late at night. With his baton gripped tightly, he was ready to escalate, until the distant hum of approaching engines shattered his confidence. 3 black SUVs rolled in, their doors opening in perfect sync as a team of elite security agents stepped out, shifting the power dynamic instantly. The officer's face drained of color as he realized his mistake. The man he had just assaulted wasn't just anyone. He was protected by people far more powerful than he ever imagined. Don't miss the full story. Subscribe and like the channel to see how justice unfolds.
The night there was thick with tension. The flickering neon lights of the gas station casting eerie shadows against the pavement.
Darius King stepped out of his luxury SUV, the scent of gasoline mingling with the crisp night breeze. He had driven long stretches of empty highway before, enjoying the solitude that came with it. But tonight, as he reached for the gas pump, something in the air felt different, charged, expectant, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the edge of perception. The low rumble of an approaching police cruiser sent a ripple of unease through him. He was used to being watched, analyzed, scrutinized. His wealth, his power, his very presence in places deemed out of place, for a man like him always invited suspicion. But tonight, the gaze felt different, hungrier, waiting for something to justify its weight. The black and white vehicle rolled to a slow stop behind his SUV, its headlights glaring like unblinking eyes. Officer Greg Lawson stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt, his fingers resting lightly on the baton at his side. He had seen men like this before, expensive suits, tailored to perfection, shoes worth more than his monthly salary. Men who thought they were untouchable. But here, in this moment, Lawson was the authority. Here, he had the power. Darius barely glanced over his shoulder, his movements controlled, deliberate. He knew the drill. He had seen it play out too many times before. A simple traffic stop turned into something far more dangerous because someone decided he didn't belong. He kept his posture relaxed, his face unreadable, as Lawson approached. The officer's voice was sharp, laced with the kind of authority that didn't ask, it demanded. He wanted an answer, a reason, a justification for why Darius was here, alone at this hour. The questions were predictable. Was this his vehicle? Where was he headed? Did he have identification? Darius answered each one calmly, his tone even measured. But Lawson wasn't interested in answers. He was waiting for defiance, for the smallest crack in composure to exploit. When none came, he took a step closer, his fingers twitching against his baton. The shift was subtle, but Darius caught it, the slight widening of the stance, the tensing of the jaw, the readiness to escalate. The gas pump clicked, signaling a full tank. But neither man moved. The air between them was thick now, charged with something unseen but undeniably present. Lawson's fingers wrapped fully around his baton.
The tension snapped.
The first strike came fast, aimed for Darius's ribs. He turned just enough to absorb part of the blow, but the pain shot through him nonetheless. His instinct screamed at him to react, to fight back, but he forced himself still. He wouldn't give Lawson what he wanted. But the second strike came harder, knocking him back against the SUV. His palm pressed flat against the metal, steadying himself. Other customers at the station had frozen, their gazes darting between the unfolding scene and the safety of their own vehicles. No one stepped in. They never did. Lawson's voice was lower now, his breath coming harder. He was feeding off the moment, the rush of control. He was about to reach for his cuffs when a new sound cut through the night, the low growl of engines. Black SUVs, sleek and unmarked, rolled into the gas station like shadows stretching into the light. Their arrival was smooth, calculated. The doors opened in unison, and from them stepped men who moved with precision, with purpose. Dressed in dark suits, their presence was immediate, suffocating. For the first time, Lawson hesitated. His grip on the baton faltered. The men didn't rush forward, didn't shout or brandish weapons. They didn't need to. The shift in power had already begun. One of them, taller than the rest, with silver at his temples and a gaze sharp enough to cut steel, stepped forward.
Sir, are you all recht?
The words were crisp, professional. They weren't directed at Lawson. Darius straightened, adjusting his cufflinks as if brushing off the moment.
I'm fine.
The officer's breath hitched. He wasn't stupid. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize government presence when he saw it. These weren't ordinary security guards. The way they moved, the way they surrounded Darius without making it look like they had, told him everything he needed to know. One of the agents turned his attention to Lawson, his expression unreadable. "Officer, do you have probable cause to detain Mr. King?" The name landed with a dull thud in Lawson's chest. Recognition flashed across his face, but he masked it quickly. He swallowed, forcing his spine straight. He was acting suspicious. The agent's brow lifted slightly. "How so?" Lawson opened his mouth, then closed it. Every reason he had prepared suddenly felt flimsy, exposed beneath the weight of scrutiny. "If there is no legal justification for detainment," the agent continued, his voice still composed, "then I suggest you step aside." The words weren't a threat, but they carried the weight of something far heavier. Lawson's grip tightened around his baton once more before he exhaled sharply, stepping back. His pulse pounded as he watched the agents flank Darius, as if sealing the moment shut behind them. Darius looked at Lawson one last time. Not with anger. Not with fear.
Just quit Knoving.
A lesson had been taught here tonight, but not the one Lawson had intended. The SUVs rolled out as smoothly as they had arrived, disappearing into the night, leaving the officer standing alone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights.
The Silence stretched.
And for the first time in his career, Lawson felt powerless. The weight of the night's events settled on Darius King like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. He sat in the back of one of the SUVs, his security detail speaking in low voices through their earpieces. His mind replayed the moment, the baton's impact, the way Officer Lawson's arrogance had shifted to fear. He had seen the power shift in real time, but the echoes of that encounter would not fade so easily. Officer Greg Lawson sat alone in his patrol car, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in shallow bursts. He had always believed he controlled the narrative, that his badge granted him authority unquestioned. But tonight, the story had been rewritten before his eyes. His body still thrummed with adrenaline, but beneath it was something worse, uncertainty. He had overplayed his hand, and now the balance of power had flipped in a way he couldn't predict. Back at the precinct, the tension was thick enough to choke on. His partner, Officer Daniels, leaned against the wall of the briefing room, arms crossed. He had watched from a distance as the events unfolded at the gas station. He had seen the way Lawson had carried himself, the way he'd thought he was in control, until he wasn't. Now, he could sense the cracks forming. The department was already whispering about what happened, about the men in suits, about the way Lawson had backed down. Daniels knew what that meant. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of this. Darius King's security team moved in calculated silence. They had handled incidents like this before, but none had been this public, this charged. Their priority was containment, protecting Darius not just physically, but politically. The media was already spinning theories, trying to piece together who had intervened and why. The less people knew, the more control they had. Nathan Blake, a high-profile attorney known for dismantling corrupt institutions, leaned back in his chair as he watched the footage of the gas station incident for the third time. The viral spread of the video had been inevitable. He recognized the moment when the officer had realized who he was dealing with. That moment was power. But power needed to be wielded carefully. This wasn't just about a single encounter, this was about precedent, about making sure this didn't happen again. Inside City Hall, Mayor Judith Reynolds adjusted her glasses and exhaled sharply. The political landscape had shifted overnight, and she was caught in the eye of the storm. If she backed the police, she risked alienating the public. If she condemned them outright, she risked losing the support of law enforcement. There was no clean way out of this, but she needed to make a move before the media forced her hand. Officer Lawson's phone buzzed, the number unfamiliar. He hesitated before answering, his pulse quickening. The voice on the other end was smooth, controlled, someone who knew exactly what had happened and exactly how much trouble he was in. The words were not a suggestion. They were a directive. Damage control was already in motion, but it would come at a cost. Darius King remained quiet as his team debriefed, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago that power was not about reaction, it was about control. The officer had wanted a display of submission. Instead, he had witnessed a reversal he never saw coming. But Darius knew this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The city buzzed with speculation, every conversation laced with curiosity and tension. The power had shifted, but power was never static. It was always moving, always being tested. And in the days to come, it would be clear who truly controlled the narrative. Darius King sat in his downtown office, the events of the past 24 hours playing on repeat in his mind. The bruises on his ribs were still fresh, but the sting of the assault was nothing compared to the fire growing inside him. His security team had briefed him on every possible scenario, from media fallout to legal countermeasures. He had the resources to push back, but he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about control, who held it, who abused it, and who would win in the end. Officer Greg Lawson sat in the dim precinct conference room, his knee bouncing restlessly. His commanding officer had already called him in twice, asking for statements, clarifications, damage control. He could feel it slipping away. The thin shield of authority that had always protected him was cracking, and now, even those who once stood beside him were shifting their weight, deciding whether he was worth saving. He knew how this worked. The department wouldn't hesitate to turn its back on him if the backlash grew too loud. Daniel Grayson watched from his office, flipping through the latest news articles. He was more than a cop. He had built his career on keeping the right people in power and ensuring that the department never truly lost control of its image. The situation with Lawson was spiraling, but that wasn't what worried him. It was the precedent. If this case didn't disappear, if Darius King walked away from this unscathed, it would set a dangerous tone. Officers would hesitate. The power structure that had kept them untouchable for years would fracture. And that couldn't happen. Nathan Blake sifted through documents, his legal team preparing for the inevitable lawsuit. The footage from the gas station had already gone viral, but now they were looking deeper. Lawson wasn't just one bad cop. He was part of a system that had been quietly protecting itself for decades. Blake didn't just want a conviction. He wanted exposure. He wanted names, policies, patterns. The more he dug, the uglier it became. The protests outside City Hall swelled in numbers, the crowds growing louder with each passing hour. What had started as outrage over a single incident had evolved into something larger. People weren't just demanding justice for Darius King. They were demanding change, accountability, reform. The city's leadership was on edge, watching closely, waiting to see if this moment would pass like so many others before it. But this time, something felt different. The pressure wasn't fading. Lawson's phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing across the screen. He hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was familiar, one of his higher-ups, speaking in clipped, deliberate tones. The message was clear: keep quiet, stick to the script, and they would take care of him. But even as he nodded along, he wasn't sure if he believed them. He had seen officers disappear before, thrown under the bus when it became convenient. He had always assumed it wouldn't happen to him.
Darius King exhaled slowly, Hayesgase stidi.
He knew how this would play out. They would try to discredit him, to paint him as the aggressor, to shift the narrative before it could solidify. But he had spent his career dealing with men who thought they were untouchable. This time, he wasn't going to let them write the ending. Darius King leaned against his desk, his fingers tracing the faint bruises beneath his sleeve. He had spent years wielding power in boardrooms and negotiations, but never had the weight of it felt so personal. The events of the past few days had forced him into a position he never wanted, to be the face of a fight that stretched far beyond his own experience. The legal team had laid out their strategy, the security detail had reinforced his protection, but none of it could erase the underlying truth. He was now a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. Greg Lawson sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, his thoughts racing faster than he could control. His superiors had told him to sit tight, to keep his mouth shut, that this would all blow over if he let them handle it. But he had seen it happen before. Officers left to take the fall when the department needed a scapegoat. The weight of what had happened was pressing down on him, not just from the public scrutiny, but from the realization that, for the first time in his life, he might actually face consequences. Daniel Grayson watched the news feed from his office, his jaw clenched. He had spent decades protecting the department from public backlash, ensuring that bad press was minimized, that officers like Lawson had the shield of bureaucracy to hide behind. But this was different. The security footage had spread too fast. The protests had gained too much traction. There was no stopping this storm. Now, the only question was how to contain it before it burned everything down. Nathan Blake flipped through a stack of depositions, each one detailing a system of abuse that had been carefully concealed over the years. This case was no longer just about Darius King or Greg Lawson. It was about an entire infrastructure that had allowed men like Lawson to act with impunity. The deeper he dug, the more he found. Internal reports buried, complaints dismissed, settlements paid in secret. This wasn't just one incident. This was a pattern. The city's protests had escalated. What began as demonstrations outside the precinct had spread to City Hall, to corporate headquarters, to federal buildings. The people weren't just angry, they were demanding systemic change. The mayor's office had become a fortress of panicked strategists, each one trying to determine how to pacify the crowds without giving in to demands that could dismantle the very foundation of their authority. Lawson's lawyer entered the interrogation room, his face a carefully controlled mask of neutrality. The department had given them a directive: hold the line, do not admit fault, let the media cycle run its course. But even the lawyer knew that was a weak strategy at best. Lawson wasn't just another officer anymore. He was the lightning rod of a movement. And the people calling the shots weren't sure if they wanted to save him or sacrifice him. Darius King exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening as the next phase of his plan settled into place. They had underestimated him. They had thought he would take his beating, that he would let this fade into just another headline. But they were wrong. This fight wasn't just his. And he was about to prove that to everyone watching. Darius King adjusted his tie, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. He had spent the last few days fielding calls, dodging reporters, and watching as the weight of the case pressed harder on the people who had tried to bury him. But he wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was preparing to go on the offensive. The legal team was tightening their grip, and the security footage that had exposed Greg Lawson was just the beginning. Now, the question wasn't whether justice would be served, it was how much of the system would collapse in the process.
Greg Lawson sat in a holding cell, staring at the cold metal bars.
The department had cut ties with him faster than he had expected. The police union had issued a carefully worded statement, distancing themselves from his actions, but it was clear to everyone what was happening. He was being made an example. The rage in his gut burned hotter than ever. He had followed protocol. He had done what he had always been told was acceptable. And now, they were throwing him to the wolves. Daniel Grayson worked the phones relentlessly, trying to control the damage before it became irreversible. He had maneuvered his way through scandals before, but this was different. The media had latched onto the story like a predator refusing to let go. More than that, internal sources were beginning to talk. The system that had once protected officers like Lawson was suddenly crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before it took others down with it. Nathan Blake stood at the head of a war room filled with legal strategists, analysts, and activists. The case had become a catalyst for something much larger than anyone had anticipated. They weren't just dealing with a single case of police brutality, they were tearing open a wound that had been festering for decades. His team had gathered a mountain of evidence, and as they laid it out piece by piece, the picture became undeniable. This wasn't a mistake. This was systemic. The protests had reached their peak. What had started as a demonstration in front of the precinct had now expanded across the city. Every government office, every major corporation with ties to law enforcement was under scrutiny. People weren't asking for change anymore. They were demanding it. The streets pulsed with energy, a movement that refused to be silenced. Greg Lawson's lawyer entered the holding cell, his expression grim. The prosecution had enough evidence to bury him. His only way out was cooperation. But cooperation meant betrayal. It meant turning against the department that had trained him, against the officers who still believed he was one of them. His options were narrowing, and no matter what he chose, he knew he wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. Darius King leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had spent years watching the system protect itself, watching as men like Lawson were shielded from the consequences of their actions. But not this time. This time, they had miscalculated. He wasn't just a victim. He was a force they hadn't been prepared for. And now, they were going to learn what happened when power shifted in the other direction. Darius King sat in the conference room, his hands folded as the legal team ran through their final preparations. Every document, every piece of evidence, every statement had been analyzed and dissected to ensure there were no loose ends. He wasn't just fighting for justice now, he was fighting to reshape the very system that had enabled officers like Greg Lawson to act without consequence. The pressure weighed heavily, but he had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this. Greg Lawson's hands were cuffed in front of him as he was led into the courtroom. The air was thick with expectation, the seats packed with reporters, activists, and high-ranking officials watching to see what would happen next. His lawyer had told him to remain calm, to appear composed, but inside, the fury and betrayal boiled. He had been abandoned by the department, discarded like a liability. The same system that had protected him for years was now threatening to crush him. Daniel Grayson stood near the back of the courtroom, watching the proceedings unfold. He had worked behind the scenes to mitigate the fallout, but it was clear now that this was beyond his control. Lawson had been deemed expendable, but how long before others in the department were forced into the spotlight? The foundation they had built was cracking, and there was no telling how much longer it would hold. Nathan Blake reviewed his notes one last time before stepping into the courtroom. He had spent months preparing for this, uncovering layers of corruption buried beneath years of institutional silence. Lawson's trial was the first domino, but the real fight was just beginning. The case had unearthed a systemic rot that extended far beyond a single officer, and if they played their cards right, they could force lasting change. Outside, the protests had reached their peak. The courthouse steps were flooded with demonstrators, their voices rising in unison, demanding accountability. The energy was electric, a collective force refusing to be ignored. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a system that had spent decades protecting those in power while silencing those who spoke out. Inside the courtroom, the judge called for order. Lawson's attorney stood to make his opening statement, carefully crafting a narrative of misunderstanding and procedural missteps. But the prosecution was ready. They presented the footage, the witness testimonies, the evidence that left no room for doubt. Every detail painted a picture of abuse, of a man who had believed he was untouchable, until now. Darius King remained still, watching as the proceedings unfolded. He had been on the receiving end of injustice before, but this time, he had power. He had truth. And he wasn't going to let anyone rewrite the story to protect those who had caused harm. Greg Lawson's grip tightened as the reality of his situation settled in. He had thought he could control the narrative, that his badge would still carry weight in the courtroom. But as he listened to the prosecution dismantle his defense piece by piece, he realized for the first time that there would be no easy escape. The system he had relied on was crumbling, and he was sinking with it. Darius King remained seated, his composure unwavering despite the storm brewing around him. The courtroom was filled with whispers, tense exchanges between legal teams, and the weight of unspoken truths. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, was another thread unraveling the fabric of protection that had shielded officers like Greg Lawson for decades. He knew this wasn't just about one trial, this was about setting a precedent. Greg Lawson's pulse pounded in his ears as he sat at the defense table, his fingers curled into tight fists. The case against him was airtight, but he still clung to the belief that the system would find a way to spare him. It always had before. His attorney had crafted a defense that leaned on procedure, on justifications, on fear tactics meant to sway the jury. But nothing seemed to be landing the way they had hoped. Daniel Grayson observed from a distance, his jaw tight. He had worked his entire career to keep officers protected, to ensure that internal affairs investigations never reached a public courtroom. But this time, things had spiraled beyond control. The department was no longer whispering about damage control. They were openly discussing how to sever ties before the entire structure collapsed. Nathan Blake paced in the hallway outside the courtroom, his mind racing. The case had started as one officer's abuse of power, but it had evolved into something much larger. More names were surfacing, internal emails exposing decades of misconduct. He had to stay ahead, to make sure that this trial wasn't just a singular moment of accountability, but the beginning of something far greater. Outside, the protests continued to grow. The courthouse steps were packed with demonstrators, their voices echoing through the city. The public wasn't satisfied with just one officer on trial. They wanted reform, they wanted systemic change. The pressure was mounting, and those in power were starting to feel it. Inside, the prosecution was relentless. Witness after witness took the stand, each one painting a clearer picture of the unchecked authority that had allowed Lawson to act without consequence. The jury's expressions had shifted over the course of the trial. Doubt had turned to understanding, hesitation to conviction. The weight of the truth was becoming undeniable. Greg Lawson's lawyer made one last attempt to salvage what was left, questioning a key witness with a thinly veiled threat. But it backfired. The witness, emboldened by the momentum of the trial, refused to back down.
The moment hung heavy in the air. One man, once protected by the system, now exposed with no defense left to hide behind.
Darius King leaned forward slightly, exhaling. He could see it now, the inevitability of what was coming. The verdict would not just determine Lawson's fate. It would send a message to every officer, every institution that had believed itself untouchable. And for the first time, real accountability was within reach. The courtroom was silent, an unnatural stillness hanging over the room as the jury foreperson stood. The moment had arrived. The weeks of evidence, of testimonies, of mounting public pressure had led to this. Darius King remained seated, his expression calm but his fingers tightening on the edge of the table. He had learned long ago that justice was never guaranteed, even when the truth was undeniable. Greg Lawson felt his chest tighten, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His lawyer had assured him they had done everything they could, but deep down, he knew the truth. The system that had always protected him was fracturing. The faces of the jury were unreadable, but he could feel the weight of what was coming. Daniel Grayson sat motionless at the back of the courtroom, his grip on his phone tightening. He had made calls, pulled strings, tried to shift the narrative, but it hadn't been enough. The department had already distanced itself, leaving Lawson to take the fall. The conversation had changed. It was no longer about protecting one officer, it was about preserving what remained of their control. Nathan Blake leaned forward slightly, his pulse steady. He had spent his career tearing down corrupt institutions, but this moment felt different. This wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning. The prosecution had done its job, the evidence had been presented, and now, all that was left was the verdict. Outside the courthouse, the protests had swelled to their largest numbers yet. The energy was raw, electric. The crowd wasn't just waiting, they were demanding.
Zins, banners, voice shooting into the night.
This wasn't about one man. This was about history, about every case that had been buried, every name that had been forgotten. The foreperson cleared their throat and read the verdict. Guilty. Greg Lawson barely had time to react before the courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some cheered, some merely sat in stunned silence. The walls that had shielded men like him for so long had finally crumbled. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. Now, he was nothing more than another convicted criminal, his fate sealed.
Darius King let out a slow breath, absorbing the moment.
It wasn't victory. Not entirely. The verdict was just one step in a much larger fight. He had spent his life pushing against walls that refused to move, but today, one of them had cracked. Daniel Grayson was already moving toward the exit, his mind spinning. The conversation inside the department would change now. Officers would hesitate, second guess. This case had sent a message, and he knew better than anyone how dangerous that could be. Nathan Blake stood, gathering his files. This case had been won, but the real battle was just beginning. The system wouldn't collapse overnight. But today had proven that cracks could be made, and eventually, those cracks would be enough to break everything apart. The crowd outside erupted as the news spread. Some wept, some cheered, some merely stood in stunned silence. But one thing was clear, this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something much larger, something no one could stop now.